They yanked him by the collar like garbage left in the wrong building. No warning, no words, just muscle and contempt dragging a black man across polished marble, while executives walked by like he was a stain on their morning. No one asked who he was. No one cared. In that pristine lobby built for wealth and whiteness, the message was loud without a sound. You don't belong here. Security didn't whisper, didn't hesitate. They moved with the confidence of people who knew the system was on their side. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the man they humiliated had the power to bring the whole tower down from the inside. They weren't just tossing out a stranger. They were burying their own future. This is the story of how silence protects power, and how one man turned that silence into a weapon. If you're feeling this already, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with where you're watching from. Tell me what part hits you hardest, because it only gets heavier from here. The wind cut between the glass and steel towers of Midtown with precision, slicing through overcoats and slapping newspapers into gutters. On 6th Avenue, just beyond the rush of impatient taxi horns and damp sidewalks, stood the monolithic entrance to Hargrave Equity Tower. 46 stories of concrete wealth, polished brass, and power meetings behind one-way glass. It was the kind of building that didn't welcome you. It permitted you. Malric Devlin stepped out of a gray rideshare with one hand on his satchel and the other tightening his collar against the cold drizzle that misted the air. He was dressed well, but not extravagantly. A dark charcoal coat, matching slacks, and a leather briefcase worn smooth from years of careful use. His shoes were polished. His face was calm. As the glass doors whispered open ahead of him, Malric adjusted the plastic ID clipped to his lapel, double-checked the time on his phone, and stepped into the gleaming lobby. The space inside Hargrave was cavernous. Every inch of the lobby seemed designed to make a visitor feel small. The floor was a mirror-finished stretch of jet black marble, reflecting the ceilings 5 stories above. The walls were gray stone flecked with quartz, cool and sterile. At the far end, a reception desk rose like an altar, staffed by a woman in a slate-gray suit who barely looked up. A few paces in, the scent of expensive polish and fresh orchids hit Malric's senses. He moved forward, walking with measured calm toward the desk. It was his first time in this building, but he had been in places like it before. He knew the rules. Speak clearly, make eye contact, never let irritation surface. Before he could reach the desk, a figure stepped into his path. Byron Trask wore the uniform of a private security officer, though the blazer barely contained the mass of his chest and shoulders. His head was shaven close, his jaw clenched with the confidence of someone who knew he could decide your day with one word. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask for ID. His hand shot out and plucked the badge from Malric's lapel, without a word, the motion quick and invasive. The clip snapped off with a sound too loud in the quiet lobby. Byron examined the badge like it might be fake, rotating it with visible contempt, then let it fall from his hand. It hit the marble with a flat clack, spinning once before settling face down. Malric blinked. He bent to pick it up, but before he could, Byron stepped forward, placing the sole of his heavy boot directly on top of the badge. The boot didn't press hard, but it made a point. Malric straightened slowly, his breath catching in his chest, eyes level with Byron's chin. He opened his mouth to speak, to clarify, to explain he had an appointment on the 34th floor with the acquisitions director, but no words came out. Byron was staring down at him like he'd found a stain on the lobby floor. Behind him, a pair of young professionals, one man and one woman, paused on their way to the elevator bank. The man gave a quiet chuckle, clearly entertained. The woman glanced at Malric, rolled her eyes, and kept walking. The receptionist tapped something on her tablet, not bothering to look up. No one said anything. No one asked questions. Then came the grab. Byron's hand shot out and twisted into Malric's collar, yanking him backward with practiced efficiency. Malric stumbled, one foot catching on the polished floor, the other sliding halfway out of his shoe. The marble was too slick, too unforgiving. The motion tore the seam in the shoulder of his coat and pulled his scarf tight against his neck. He tried to resist, to dig in his heels without appearing combative, but Byron was too strong. He dragged Malric with one hand like a misbehaving child toward the revolving door. People watched. No one intervened. One man near the espresso cart leaned in to whisper to his colleague. Another snapped his fingers for the receptionist to speed up his visitor check-in. Malric saw their expressions: indifference, annoyance, subtle amusement. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't a businessman. He was an interruption, a problem to be handled. The revolving door clicked into motion as Byron pushed Malric through it. The glass curved behind him, and in seconds he was outside again, back in the gray morning light with rain needling his face. He caught himself on the wet concrete, breath escaping his chest in a sharp gasp. His coat was crooked, collar creased, one sock soaked through. The shoe he lost inside was kicked out after him seconds later, tumbling to a stop near the trash bin just outside the entrance. Malric stared at the door for a long moment, the cold seeping into his sleeves. His badge was still inside. He thought about going back in, demanding to speak to someone, anyone. But he knew how that would end. A second confrontation. A second humiliation. Maybe worse. He stood still until the cold pushed him into motion. He retrieved his shoe and walked slowly along the building's outer wall until he reached a narrow alcove just past the delivery entrance. It was dry there at least. He reattached his shoe, wiped the toe clean with a tissue from his pocket, and pulled his phone out. The appointment confirmation glared back at him. His name, the date, the time, the floor, the email signature from Madison Covington, Director of Strategic Acquisitions. All of it valid, all of it meaningless. A part of him had been bruised in a way he couldn't explain aloud, not to the driver who greeted him that morning, not to the doorman who nodded politely as he stepped into the town car. The city outside blurred past the windows as he made the same journey again, one street at a time, each stoplight a quiet reminder that he was choosing to return to the place that had tried to erase him. He wasn't naive. He knew what yesterday had been. It hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been a miscommunication. It had been deliberate. And yet he returned. Not because he had anything to prove, but because leaving would mean accepting their definition of him. He would not do that. As the car pulled up to Hargrave Equity Tower, Malric stepped out onto the dry sidewalk, coat crisp, scarf tied carefully, the air biting but clean. He approached the same glass doors, heart steady but breath tight. This time, he didn't enter through the revolving door. He paused just outside, pulled out his phone, and opened the appointment email again. It hadn't changed. Neither had he. Then he walked in. The lobby looked exactly the same, bright, orderly, indifferent. The security desk sat like a fortress behind polished brass rails, and Byron Trask stood beside it like a wall of flesh and contempt. Malric walked toward the desk, gaze level, posture straight. He didn't slow when Byron turned toward him, eyes narrowing with vague recognition. Malric reached into his coat, pulled out his ID badge, and held it up for inspection. Byron didn't take it. He didn't speak. Instead, he nodded toward the receptionist, who this time looked directly at Malric and motioned for him to wait. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the bureaucratic pause of inconvenience. Malric stepped back, folded his hands calmly in front of him, and waited. The minutes stretched. People passed. Suits and heels and Bluetooth headsets glided by, unbothered. A man with graying temples and an expensive leather briefcase gave Malric a cursory glance, then turned his attention back to the phone pressed to his ear. A woman with sharp eyes and sharper lipstick stepped past him and greeted Byron by name. Byron grinned, stepped aside to let her pass, and nodded once toward the elevators. She never looked at Malric. The receptionist tapped something on her screen, frowned, then glanced up. She asked Malric to confirm his name. He did calmly. She asked him to wait again. A junior staffer came down in a navy blazer, glanced at Malric from across the lobby, then leaned over the receptionist's desk to whisper something. Byron crossed his arms. The staffer left without speaking to Malric. The receptionist finally called Malric forward. She told him the meeting had been moved, but she didn't know where. She suggested he reschedule. Malric stood still for a moment, processing the words, parsing their layers. Then he nodded, thanked her, and turned to leave. As he did, Byron muttered something under his breath. Malric heard it. So did the man waiting in line behind him. The man laughed. Malric didn't react. He walked toward the door with his spine rigid, each step a silent battle against the urge to turn back, to respond, to force them to see him. But he knew what that would cost. Outside, the air had turned colder. He didn't stop walking. He moved past the stone pillars, down the block, around the corner where the wind was quieter. He reached into his coat, pulled out his phone again, and dialed. The voice on the other end belonged to the assistant of the director he was supposed to meet. She sounded confused, apologetic, said there was no cancellation. She asked if he was sure he'd checked in at the right location. Malric thanked her and hung up. He didn't go home. He wandered. He moved through the city like a shadow, past plazas and fountains and cafes full of people who didn't look like him, who didn't carry the invisible weight pressing against his shoulders. He walked until his feet ached and his hands numbed. He passed a public library, paused in front of the glass, and saw his reflection staring back at him, silent and tired and angry. Not angry like heat, angry like weight, like pressure, like being trapped in a box that everyone else pretends isn't there. He returned to his apartment after dark. The hallway light flickered overhead. The lock on his door stuck twice before clicking open. Inside, he poured water into a kettle, stood at the window, and watched the city lights flicker like lies. He didn't drink the tea. He sat in silence and tried not to replay the words from earlier. Tried not to think about the look on Byron's face, the whisper, the smirk. But they stayed. They lived in the walls of his thoughts. He pressed his fingers against his eyes until color burst behind the lids. The next morning, he woke early, showered, dressed. This time, no scarf, no badge. He stood in the mirror again and studied his reflection. He didn't see anything wrong with himself. And yet, 2 days in a row, they had treated him like a stain, as if his presence disturbed the pattern of their world. He couldn't go back yet. Not now. Not again. But he also couldn't stay still. He needed to move forward, even if the next step meant swallowing more silence. He left his apartment and walked instead of calling a ride. He passed storefronts with closed blinds, construction sites echoing with early drills, and trash bins overflowing with last night's excess. He passed 2 men arguing over a cab and a woman yelling into her phone. He kept walking. He didn't stop until he reached the river. There he sat on a bench, let the morning sun settle on his face, and breathed. He wore the badge again, newly printed, tucked in the breast pocket of his blazer instead of clipped outside. It was a quiet refusal to let the first insult define the rules of engagement. This time, he didn't take a car. He walked. From 32nd Street to 43rd, up the avenue under a bleached sky, with brittle clouds rolling across the skyline. People passed with coffees and headphones, heads down, eyes locked to screens. He walked at a steady pace, no rush, no stutter in his stride. When he reached Hargrave Equity Tower, he paused only once to straighten his jacket, adjusted the cuff on his left sleeve, and entered. The lobby hadn't changed. It was still pristine, still cold, still echoing with the soft hush of money. The concierge at the desk glanced up. There was a flicker of recognition, but no greeting. Behind the security checkpoint, Byron stood like an immovable shadow, arms crossed, posture wide, expression neutral but watchful. Malric approached the desk calmly. He presented his ID, spoke his name clearly, and stated the meeting he had rescheduled from 2 days earlier. The concierge didn't respond with words. She tapped at her keyboard, frowned, then glanced up and said his contact was unavailable. She did not offer a seat. She did not offer to check again. Malric asked her to confirm with the department directly. She hesitated, as if inconvenienced, then picked up the phone and dialed. Her voice dropped to a murmur as she turned slightly away from the desk, shielding her face with her hand. Malric didn't move. He stood with his feet planted, hands folded behind his back, his gaze steady. The minutes passed slowly. When she hung up, The concierge gave him a tight smile and said his contact had left the building for the day. There was no note, no alternate appointment, no message, nothing. Malric didn't respond immediately. He asked if there was someone else from the department he could speak with. The concierge shook her head. The conversation was over before it had started. Behind him, Byron shifted. Malric heard the step, the deliberate thud of the man's boots across the marble. Byron approached slowly, stopping beside the desk, hands on his hips, eyes fixed on Malric. He didn't speak, but the meaning was clear. Malric was expected to leave. Again, Malric didn't flinch. He didn't turn. He asked the concierge to provide a written acknowledgement of the canceled meeting. She blinked, surprised. No one ever asked that. She said she couldn't do that. Malric repeated the request, calmly. She hesitated, then glanced at Byron. Byron stepped forward, now invading Malric's personal space, his shoulder nearly brushing Malric's, as if to signal ownership of the floor. Malric turned his head slightly. He did not step back. He asked again. Byron interjected now, telling him the request was unnecessary, that lingering in the lobby without an appointment was against policy. Malric pointed out that he had, in fact, an appointment, one now denied without explanation. Byron's voice tightened. The concierge looked increasingly uncomfortable. At that moment, another staff member exited one of the elevators. A man in a gray tailored suit, mid-30s, with a leather folder tucked under one arm. He slowed when he saw the trio at the desk. Malric recognized him from online research, a junior partner from acquisitions. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Recognition passed. Then the man looked away, increased his pace, and exited the building without a word. Malric watched him go. Byron ordered him to leave. Malric didn't argue. He gave one final look to the concierge, a quiet pause to let her see the restraint in his expression. Then he turned and walked away. He reached the sidewalk without speaking. The wind pressed against his coat as if trying to fold him in on himself. He didn't stop. He walked 4 blocks east, then ducked into a quiet alley between 2 brownstones and stood with his back against the wall. The cold seeped through the fabric of his blazer. He closed his eyes, not in pain, in calculation. This was not incompetence. This was a pattern. The ignored appointment, the erased schedule, the failure to acknowledge his presence, the subtle escalation of physical dominance by Byron, always just outside the lines of complaint. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to deny him access, enough to make him feel unwanted, enough to try and convince him to go away. He wasn't going away. He stayed in the alley for another 10 minutes, collecting his breath, letting the fog in his chest settle. When he finally stepped out, he didn't return home. He went to the library. He sat at a public computer and began reviewing public company records, press releases, and acquisition filings. He pulled up every public name associated with Hargrave Equity's last 2 investment cycles. He downloaded org charts, bios, and promotional photos. He took notes. That evening, he didn't speak to anyone. He cooked dinner, left it untouched on the counter, and sat on the edge of his bed staring at the muted glow of the street lamp outside his window. He could still feel the heat of Byron's breath from that moment at the desk. Not fear, not anger, something older, something deeper, a sense of being sized up and dismissed before speaking. The third day had been the worst, not because it was louder, but because it was quiet, because everything had been executed with such calm cruelty. By the time the sky darkened fully, Malric had begun drafting a letter. Not to complain, not to plead, to document. Each sentence was written plainly, chronologically, describing the events of the past 3 days, the sequence of denials, the names, the locations. Not for public use, not yet, but for the record, for truth, for when it would matter. He had not expected open arms or apologies, but he also hadn't expected such a meticulously executed dismissal. What struck him now, more than the obvious acts of denial, was the coordination, the calm consistency with which the gatekeeping was performed. Every face behind the desk, every glance from security, Every delayed check-in or canceled meeting hadn't felt spontaneous. They had felt instructed. So this time, Malric had no intention of approaching the desk. Today, he wouldn't test the system directly. He would study it. He reached the lobby just after the main rush began. Business people flowed through the revolving doors in tailored waves, badges flashing, greetings exchanged with the security staff like old friends. Malric stood off to the side, pretending to review messages on his phone while watching the patterns. Byron, the ever-present enforcer, greeted a tall executive by name and shared a brief joke that made the man laugh too loudly. Behind the desk, the receptionist who had turned him away on the second day leaned toward a colleague, pointing discreetly at a clipboard filled with highlighted entries. Twice, Malric saw them look up and glance across the lobby, not at him, but at others who bore a certain look, a certain polish, a certain comfort with the space. They were all welcomed without hesitation. Then something shifted. A young man in a tan trench coat entered from the street, hesitating at the door before approaching the desk. He looked nervous. He looked new. His badge was upside down, his coat rumpled, his shoes inexpensive. The receptionist frowned, motioned for Byron. Byron walked over, said something Malric couldn't hear, and gestured toward the side entrance. The young man resisted for a moment, pointing to something on his phone, but Byron's expression flattened. The next thing Malric saw was the man being guided, firmly but without spectacle, toward the side hallway used by delivery staff and janitors. Malric's stomach twisted. It was all done with such efficiency. No shouting, no spectacle, just quiet exclusion. As if the building knew who belonged before a word was spoken. He stayed another hour, taking mental notes, cataloging interactions. He left without incident, returned to a nearby cafe, and began organizing what he had observed. Patterns emerged. A list of faces passed through unbothered. A list of faces redirected or delayed. It was clear that Hargrave operated on more than policy. It operated on perception, on an unspoken, shared agreement about who was welcome and who was not. That afternoon, Malric scheduled a meeting at a neutral location with a consultant who had once worked at Hargrave. She arrived late, nervous, and declined to be recorded. They sat at a back booth in a midtown diner, the kind where the lights buzz faintly and coffee is served in ceramic mugs that haven't changed in 2 decades. She was pale, early 30s, and fidgeted with her scarf. Malric asked careful questions. She gave careful answers. Yes, there were internal emails about visitor profiles. Yes, some clients were flagged for additional clearance checks, but it was never official. It was always couched in words like security, alignment, and client protocol refinement. She didn't have documents. She didn't name names, but her tone said enough. There were practices in place. There were lists, preferences, redirections. The system was not neutral. Malric thanked her. She left quickly, avoiding eye contact as she pushed out into the cold. That evening, Malric returned to his apartment and began compiling everything he had gathered. He now had 4 days of observation, behavioral patterns among staff, a vague but telling interview, and a deepening understanding of how power at Hargrave was exercised not through confrontation, but through erosion. They didn't attack. They diminished. They didn't reject. They ignored until the subject broke away on their own, made to feel unworthy by the environment alone. He stared at the files on his screen, then opened a blank document. He began writing a summary of his experiences, not to send, not yet, but to see them laid out in full. The clarity that came with writing was startling. Day 1, removed by force. Day 2, ignored and erased. Day 3, dismissed with subtle contempt. Day 4, silent surveillance, validation of his suspicions. Each day reinforced the next, a staircase of cruelty built from smiles and policies and nods that meant no. He saved the document, encrypted it, and stepped away from the desk. Outside, the wind was howling through the alley like something feral. The next morning, Malric arrived earlier than usual. The lobby was emptier, the desk staff just settling in. He stood across the street, watching the slow arrival of employees. He wasn't alone. A sanitation worker swept near the curb. eyes flicking up toward the building. A courier waited for someone to sign a digital pad. A woman in a crisp pantsuit paused to apply lipstick in the reflection of the glass. Hargrave stood indifferent to them all. Byron stepped out briefly, checked something on his clipboard, then turned and said something to a man in a dark vest who had just arrived with a rolling cart. The man nodded, followed him inside. Malric recognized him from earlier surveillance, a subcontractor with a badge that gave him limited access. Malric's pulse quickened. An idea formed. He waited 15 minutes, then walked around to the rear entrance, watched the building breathe from a different angle. Here, there were no suits, no soft jazz in the lobby. Just dumpsters, freight doors, and men in gray jumpsuits. He stood there long enough to see patterns in who entered, who was checked, who was ignored. No one asked questions. The assumption was that if you belonged back here, you were invisible. He found employment cycles that never included outreach to diverse candidates, vendor policies that subtly discouraged small, independent contractors, community statements carefully written to say something that meant nothing. But documents alone didn't expose the reality. Actions did. Patterns did. And over the past 4 days, Hargrave had revealed itself in every smirk, every delay, every redirected badge, every door that swung open only for the chosen few. Today would be different, not because he expected them to change, but because he needed to walk the line between presence and disruption, not enough to get thrown out, but enough to make them show their hand again. He arrived in the lobby just before the mid-morning lull, wearing a brown wool overcoat with a collar turned slightly up, a choice made deliberately to disrupt the image of formality he had projected in previous visits. He carried no bag. No badge was visible. His shoes were clean but modest. He looked neither rich nor poor, neither official nor intrusive. He looked ordinary. And that, at Hargrave, made him suspect. He stepped just inside the glass doors and waited. A cluster of suited men crossed the floor toward the elevators, badges in hand. Casual conversation rising like smoke. Behind the desk, the receptionist frowned slightly as she noticed him. Byron, ever watchful, appeared from around the corner within moments. His steps were heavy but measured. His eyes went to Malric immediately, not with surprise, but with weariness, as if dealing with a recurring technical issue. Malric did not approach the desk. He stood beside the indoor planter wall, where natural light filtered through the ceiling in long, sterile shafts. He did not speak. He did not move, but his presence alone triggered response. The receptionist made a call, voice hushed. Byron walked slowly in his direction, stopping just close enough to assert proximity, but not engage directly. Malric turned to him with a nod that was not quite friendly, not quite confrontational. Byron stared back without a word, jaw clenched, one hand resting on his belt as if unconsciously reminding them both of his authority. A second guard, shorter but broader, emerged from the hallway behind the reception desk and took up position near the concierge. A silent signal. Malric knew the choreography. They wouldn't ask him to leave unless he made a move. But they were ready. Minutes passed. People began to take notice. Not everyone, but enough. A woman in a gray trench coat paused long enough to glance between Malric and Byron, then leaned toward the receptionist to ask something. The receptionist smiled politely and shook her head. A man in a navy suit whispered to his colleague as they passed, then laughed just loud enough for Malric to hear. The sound was light, amused, dismissive, like watching a performance, like mocking an inconvenience. One by one, subtle glances stacked into atmosphere. He felt the weight of it, not sharp, but persistent, like water grinding stone. The security staff didn't need to touch him to make their point. The building itself worked like an immune system, identifying and rejecting anything foreign. After nearly 40 minutes of standing silently, Malric walked calmly toward the reception desk. He requested to speak to a scheduling liaison for client relations. The receptionist blinked, feigned confusion, then asked if he had an appointment. He gave her his name. She typed slowly, fingers hovering above the keyboard with exaggerated caution. Then she told him there was no record of a scheduled meeting. He asked if he could leave a note for Ms. Covington, the acquisitions director. She said she wasn't authorized to relay personal messages. He asked if a digital message could be sent through the internal system. She said she didn't have access to the internal staff directory. Every question was met with another excuse. Every effort met with a soft no. Behind her, Byron continued watching. Then a new development. A younger man, perhaps 25, stepped into the lobby wearing Hargrave's access badge and carrying a leather laptop case. He looked tired, rushed, and distracted. As he passed by, he gave Malric a glance, paused, then turned back and asked if he needed assistance. His voice was casual, unaware. The receptionist's face tightened. Byron stepped forward instantly and interrupted, telling the younger man that the matter was already being handled. The young man looked confused, nodded slowly, then continued to the elevator. Malric saw it. In that brief moment, the reality cracked. Not everyone was in on the script, but those who weren't were quickly redirected. He thanked the receptionist and turned to leave, not in defeat, but in data collection. Outside, the air was warmer, but his chest felt cold. He walked 2 blocks and sat at a bus stop, pulling out a notebook from his coat pocket. He wrote in clear, sharp letters, "Day 5 presence escalates passive resistance." Guard reinforcements appeared within 3 minutes. Subtle humiliation reinforced by bystander reaction. Attempt to create isolation through non-engagement. Mockery from other clients introduced as pressure mechanism. Staff coordination confirmed. He closed the notebook and stared out at the traffic. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strain of being reduced over and over in public, of having to prove his right to exist in the same air, the same square footage, the same profession. He was tired, but clarity had taken root. Hargrave's cruelty wasn't loud. It was procedural. It had learned to be quiet, so no one could name it directly. It weaponized tone, posture, response time, proximity. They echoed in the hollow behind his ribs, in the place where anger should have burned, but had instead hardened into something colder, heavier, more permanent. Today was not about another attempt to be heard. Today was about seeing how far they would go if the target of their control refused to disappear. He had no badge with him, no documentación, no meeting scheduled. He entered the building not as a client, not as a professional, not as a person with a reason. He entered simply as himself, stripped of every pretext and support they had used against him in previous days. The moment he passed through the glass doors, the atmosphere shifted. It didn't take a word. The receptionist's eyes locked on him instantly, a flicker of unease passing across her face before she reached for the phone. Byron Trask appeared as if summoned, his steps louder than necessary, boots echoing across marble with the arrogance of unchallenged power. He didn't stop a foot away this time. He walked right up to Malric, placed himself inches from his face, and told him he was violating access protocol. Malric didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply stood there, breathing steadily, refusing to justify his presence. Byron's face tensed as he gestured to the second guard, the same thick-set man from the day before. The second guard moved in, without waiting for further instruction. The two of them now flanked Malric like walls. What happened next was not loud. It was quiet, controlled, brutal in its subtlety. They didn't push him. They didn't shout. They simply surrounded him, spoke to him with lowered voices, and made it impossible for him to remain. They told him he was making clients uncomfortable. They said he was interfering with scheduled operations. They said they were escorting him through a secure exit for protocol compliance. Then they turned him toward the back hall, not the front door he had entered through, not the main lobby where he could be seen, but the service corridor. Malric didn't resist. He allowed himself to be led down the narrow hallway that smelled faintly of ammonia and printer toner, passing fire doors and maintenance closets until they reached the freight elevator. The ceiling tiles here were stained with age. The floor was concrete. There were no orchids, no artwork, no warmth, just utility. They rode the elevator in silence. Malric stood between them, his face unreadable. When the doors opened, the exit was not the one at the main plaza. It was the service dock. A cold, low-ceilinged alley in the rear of the tower, flanked by dumpsters and recycling bins. One of the guards gestured toward the door. Malric stepped out. The metal door clicked shut behind him. The cold hit like a slap. The alley smelled of mildew and motor oil. A truck rumbled nearby, backfiring once before rolling into traffic. Malric stood in place for several seconds, absorbing not just the humiliation of being discarded, but the precision of it. This was not about policy. This was about theater. They had wanted him gone in the most degrading way possible. There was no audience, no spectacle, just a calculated removal through the least dignified route they could choose without breaking a law. He turned slowly and looked up at the building. No windows faced this way. No cameras. No witnesses. Just a tall, featureless wall of steel and stone that exhaled money and silence. Malric walked away, the scrape of his soles against the uneven pavement, the only sound marking his departure. He didn't go home. He didn't go to the cafe. He went instead to a public library several blocks north, sat at a workstation, and opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he began typing. The report had been building for days. Today, he began shaping it into its final form. A detailed chronology of events. Names, dates, descriptions, dialogue where he could remember it exactly. He didn't embellish. He didn't editorialize. He simply told the truth in sequence, in layers, in pages of tight, factual prose. Then he appended his prior research, public records, staff listings, vendor behaviors, demographic imbalances in hiring and partnerships. He built the framework carefully, cross-referencing facts, organizing evidence, formatting with care. By the time the sun set, the report was 67 pages long. It was not a complaint. It was a case file. He saved it in 3 locations, on a secure drive in cloud storage and on an encrypted backup. He sent no emails. He made no calls. He simply prepared. The time for confrontation had passed. Hargrave had made their final move. They had discarded him, not just professionally, but physically. They had reduced him to something less than present, less than worthy. And in doing so, they had shown their hand in full. Malric walked home under the cover of nightfall, his coat pulled tightly around him, not to guard against the wind, but to protect the focus now boiling in his core. He passed streetlights flickering with age, shops closing their shutters, the city winding down. But he did not feel tired. He felt sharper than he had in days. When he opened his eyes that morning, it was not to the familiar ache of fatigue or the restrained breath of anger. It was to a clarity so sharp it felt surgical. They had treated him as if he were nothing. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was assuming that nothing fought back. He dressed simply, black slacks, pressed white shirt, no tie, no jacket. The badge they had once ripped from his lapel lay in a drawer now, irrelevant. What mattered today was not his clothes, not his presence, but his name. Not the one they had ignored, but the one they had failed to discover. The world had changed overnight, not for Hargrave, not yet, but for those around it. The report he compiled had not stayed on his laptop. In the early hours of dawn, it had been submitted to multiple investigative desks, sent to legal contacts, and shared discreetly with business ethics groups who specialized in systemic exclusion. He had not posted it online. He had not made it public. He had seeded it methodically, with people who knew how to verify facts and apply pressure where it mattered. He hadn't attached his full name to it, not yet, but he would, at the right moment. By mid-morning, he was seated across from a panel in a private room at the Metropolitan Ethics Roundtable, a quarterly session rarely covered by the press, but often watched by people who held influence over funding, public grants, and professional reputation. The roundtable was reviewing case studies submitted anonymously, and his had been pushed to the front after one of the panel's analysts flagged its clarity and substance. As they asked questions about dates, about methodology, about tone and documentation, Malric answered without flourish, without performance. He described what had happened, step by step, 6 days of silent warfare in one of the most powerful investment firms on the East Coast. He described the denials, the strategic humiliation, the systemic refusal to recognize his legitimacy. He provided names, timelines, evidence. He handed over his full report, including his own background, a background he had not yet revealed. Because the truth was, Maurik Devlin wasn't a passive consultant or a low-level analyst. He wasn't a novice trying to break into the corporate world. He was the primary architect behind a global sustainability fund valued at over $2 billion, a fund sought after by firms across the country. His work had shaped acquisition policy, environmental impact regulation, and board strategy across multiple Fortune 500 companies. His name had been kept from the spotlight because he had chosen to let the work speak. Until now, that anonymity had allowed Hargrave's security team and front desk staff to treat him like a nobody. And he had allowed it. Until now. As he finished his presentation, he gave them his full name, his title, his affiliations. He didn't have to prove who he was. The record did that for him. The panel went quiet. Some members checked their tablets, quickly confirming his role. Some blinked in disbelief. Others sat back, suddenly seeing the case not as a hypothetical or unfortunate oversight, but as a catastrophe of arrogance and misjudgment. A few members murmured about reputational risk and fiduciary exposure. He left the room with no need for dramatics. The work was done. The machine had started turning. By noon, 3 board members at Hargrave Equity had received requests for formal comment from legal teams in their own compliance division. The general counsel was briefed on a potential review into security protocols and visitor access behavior. And yet, no one had connected all the dots. Not yet. By 2 in the afternoon, Maurik received a phone call from a Hargrave liaison. The voice on the other end was trembling with an artificial warmth, the kind manufactured quickly when panic sets in. The woman apologized for the confusion earlier in the week. She said the firm deeply regretted any inconvenience. She said a lunch with the acquisitions director was now scheduled for the next morning. He thanked her politely and said he'd confirm later. He had no intention of attending. Hargrave had finally realized they had touched something they could not control. That wasn't a win. That was the opening. By evening, whispers moved faster than emails. Inside Hargrave's executive suites, damage control meetings began stacking across calendars. The security team was asked to draft a report of the last week's visitor interactions. Byron's name came up more than once. So did the names of the receptionist and junior scheduling staff, who had each played their part in denying, redirecting, and removing a man they assumed was beneath their structure. And still, no one had publicly acknowledged what they had done. Not yet. Maurik walked through Union Square at dusk, listening to the low roar of the city preparing for night. He passed people wrapped in headphones and coats, people who had no idea that a fortress across town was starting to crack. He stopped outside a newsstand and checked his phone. One of the smaller publications had already reached out with a request for comment. He didn't respond. He returned to his apartment and sat at the kitchen table, where his badge still lay untouched. His report had already been duplicated by independent investigators. He didn't need to do anything else. He would let the truth circulate until someone asked the question that mattered. How did one of the most powerful firms in Manhattan turn away the very man they had spent months trying to impress without ever realizing who he was? By the time he dressed, the first wave of emails had already reached his inbox. Some were vague and apologetic, filled with carefully crafted regret, peppered with phrases like unforeseen breakdowns in internal policy and commitment to diversity moving forward. Others were defensive, cloaked in questions that tried to shift the burden, asking if perhaps the experience had been misinterpreted or misunderstood. He responded to none of them. The power of silence belonged to him now. His name had reached them not as a whisper, but as a wave, an aftershock spreading through the boardrooms, forcing high-ranking executives to acknowledge that they had not merely rejected a client. They had insulted a stakeholder capable of shifting billions with a signature. By mid-morning, Hargrave Equity's internal communications team sent out an all-staff memo. It was short, tight, and clearly approved by legal. It referenced recent revelations about visitor experience and a renewed commitment to equitable client engagement. No names were mentioned. No blame was assigned. But everyone knew Byron Trask read the memo twice before deleting it. He didn't speak much that day, only nodded when addressed, his usual posture replaced with a rigid stillness that reeked of a man waiting for a shoe to drop. The receptionist shifted uneasily behind the desk, suddenly aware of the eyes that now watched their every interaction. One of them, a younger woman who had once smirked when Malric was redirected, avoided the security desk entirely that morning. For the first time, the building no longer felt impenetrable. It felt defensive, and that meant it was bleeding. That afternoon, Malric received a personal call from Madison Covington, the very director who had originally invited him to Hargrave. Her voice was more direct than the assistant's and more cautious than the PR-trained liaison who had called earlier. She asked to meet in person at any time convenient to him. She said she wanted to hear what had happened, truly hear it, and find a way to make things right. He agreed to meet her, not because he sought reconciliation, but because he needed to look her in the eye. They met at a private lounge on the east side, a neutral space far from Hargrave's sterile tower. When she arrived, she looked tired, not from guilt, from realization. She apologized, sincerely but carefully. She said she had no idea he had even come to the building. She said his name had never shown up on her calendar. He believed her, but that wasn't the point. The point was the system she sat atop had erased him before she even had the chance to know he existed. That kind of erasure wasn't accidental. It was systemic. She admitted as much, slowly, cautiously. She said changes were already being drafted, protocol reviews, training sessions, oversight adjustments. He listened. He nodded. But he did not thank her. There was nothing to be thankful for. He had not been saved. He had not been rescued. He had endured. That difference mattered. She asked him if he still intended to move his fund to Hargrave. He looked at her for a long time before answering. He told her trust wasn't repaired with apologies, especially when they came only after exposure. He told her trust required alignment, accountability, and presence, not just a seat at the table, but the acknowledgement of every step it took to get there. She said she understood. He wasn't sure she truly did, but he appreciated the attempt. When the meeting ended, she thanked him for his time. He said goodbye and walked into the late afternoon light, the city humming around him. Back in his apartment, he reviewed the growing list of messages that continued arriving from across the industry. Partners, allies, observers. Some were sympathetic. Others were opportunistic, hoping to align with him now that the tide had turned. He read them all, but responded to few. What mattered now was how Hargrave reacted in the dark, not how it responded in public. Behind closed doors, the firm had begun internal reviews. HR had opened an inquiry. Security protocols were dissected. New faces began appearing at desks and meetings. Consultants were brought in. It was movement born of fear, not understanding, but movement nonetheless. Later that evening, Malric sat by the window. The city spread below him like a glowing tapestry of contradictions. Injustice did not unravel overnight, but exposure was the first stitch undone. He thought of Byron. He thought of silence that had followed each of those moments, standing alone in the lobby, being escorted through the service exit, being erased without ever being confronted directly. All of it had been designed to make him go away, but he hadn't. That was the power they never accounted for, not resistance through anger, but through presence, through refusal to vanish. He had taken everything they had thrown at him and turned it into momentum. He opened his laptop one final time that night and began writing a letter, not to Hargrave, but to others like him, professionals who had walked into buildings that pretended not to see them, who had been dismissed for looking different, sounding different, existing in spaces not built for them. He didn't write it with rage. He wrote it with precision. Malric Devlin's name was now spoken with reverence and regret, no longer unknown, no longer an afterthought, but a warning stitched into every agenda. The firm had not merely insulted a powerful investor. They had revealed, in full view of industry watchers and professional ethics boards, that their culture of exclusion was not hypothetical. It was functional, precise, and dangerous. And now it was being judged. By mid-morning, News of Hargrave's internal investigation had spread beyond the firm. Confidential leaks surfaced on niche investment forums, and then the mainstream business platforms picked them up. Words like discrimination, structural bias, and client misconduct found their way into headlines, and though the articles stopped short of naming names, insiders knew exactly who had been involved. Byron Trask's security badge was deactivated that same morning. He didn't see it coming. He had arrived at the building as usual, coffee in hand, uniform pressed, face expressionless, only to find that the revolving door no longer recognized his clearance. He stood at the threshold, swiping twice before a junior guard approached with a quiet word and a folded document. Byron read it. His jaw tightened. He didn't argue. He turned and left. There was no ceremony, no confrontation, just the cold efficiency of removal, precisely the kind he had once delivered. By noon, the reception desk saw its own shift. 2 of the front staff were placed on administrative leave pending review. The phone systems logged, the visitor protocols suspended, the rotating clipboard of scheduled guests removed from the counter and replaced by a digital system managed off-site. The lobby felt exposed now, its previous quiet power fractured under scrutiny. Upstairs, the executive floor held its breath. Meetings ran back to back, not to solve the problem, but to determine how much could still be protected. Compliance officers reviewed call logs. Legal advisors drafted statements. A silence had settled over the firm, not out of discipline, but fear. Because the fallout was no longer confined to internal embarrassment. Partners had begun asking questions. Clients had begun pulling inquiries. A hedge fund withdrew interest from a pending deal. A foundation canceled a luncheon. The market had not yet reacted, but the tremors were real. Maverick Devlin had not made a public statement since his letter. He had not accepted interviews or taken phone calls from reporters. He simply existed now as a reminder of the system's failure, a name etched into boardroom whiteboards under headers labeled crisis management and stakeholder risk. What they didn't understand was that Maverick wasn't seeking vengeance. He wasn't feeding the fire. He had simply revealed the truth, and truth had no expiration date. That afternoon, an emergency board meeting convened. The firm's senior partners sat around a polished oak table with documents neatly arranged in front of them, but none of them touched the pages. They knew the facts already. The meeting was not about understanding what happened. It was about deciding who would fall for it. The managing partner, a man known for his iron composure, spoke first. He acknowledged the timeline, the misconduct, the reputational damage. He said the firm would need to make visible changes to survive the narrative now building around them. Words like transparency and accountability were used carefully, each one weighed for legal risk. Then he paused and said the firm had reached out to Mr. Devlin to offer a public apology and request a mediated conversation. A few board members nodded. Others looked down. One asked what would happen if Maverick declined. The managing partner didn't answer. He didn't need to. By evening, Hargrave's communications team sent a draft apology to their legal advisors. It was structured to sound sincere while avoiding direct admission. It emphasized lessons learned, commitments renewed, and future oversight. But it did not name Maverick. It did not name Byron. It did not name the receptionist. Maverick received a copy through a trusted contact. He read it once, then closed the file. He did not respond. The next morning, the draft leaked. An anonymous source forwarded the apology to 2 journalists who had been tracking the story from the beginning. Within hours, the leak was published, along with an exposé comparing the internal behaviors described in Maverick's report to statements given by other former clients. The article stopped just short of accusing the firm of policy-based exclusion, but the message was clear. Hargrave's leadership had created an environment that enabled the systematic dismissal of certain people, and now that environment was collapsing under its own weight. The consequences began to solidify. 3 pending investment deals stalled. A tech startup walked away from a Series C pitch. 2 key stakeholders issued statements saying they would reevaluate their association with the firm pending the outcome of the review. 1 former employee, now working at a competitor, published a short blog post recounting her own dismissal from Hargrave for reasons she had never fully understood. Until now. Her post went viral in professional circles. The story had grown from a single injustice to a pattern. Malric did not watch the fallout with satisfaction. He watched it with the stillness of someone who had known it would come. Not because he had forced it, but because it had always been inevitable. On the 10th day, as the fallout at Hargrave Equity Tower settled into a hushed routine of public relations cleanup, policy revisions, and shadowed leadership meetings, something subtle but undeniable began to take shape within the very walls that once dripped with polished arrogance. The air no longer smelled of cold marble and power. Now it carried something more human, more raw. People who had never questioned their own certainty were beginning to examine how their actions, their assumptions, and even their silences had allowed a culture of dismissal to take root and flourish. Change had not come with a parade or a press release. It came with a hollow ache, an embarrassment too deep for words, the kind that reshaped identities from the inside out. Malric Devlin had not walked through those doors again. He hadn't needed to. His presence had moved beyond his body. It had become a symbol, a scar, a mirror held up to a system too long protected by its own illusions. Inside the security office, Byron Trask sat alone, staring at a cleared locker, the fabric of his uniform folded neatly across the bench, the edges already losing their pressed definition. No one had called him since his removal. No one had offered him a chance to explain. For 6 days, he had stood tall with the belief that his authority came from structure, that his decisions were backed by the system he served. Now that system had turned from him in a single breath, the same way it had once turned from Malric, without question. He could no longer escape the truth. He had never been powerful, only permitted. And permission could be revoked. For the first time in years, he wondered what it would feel like to be seen not as a threat or an obstacle, but as a man capable of understanding. He picked up the folded uniform and placed it inside a plain cardboard box, then carried it out into the light. Across the building, the receptionist, now suspended, sat in her apartment, reading the open letter Malric had published 3 days earlier. She read it slowly, sentence by sentence, as if decoding a language she had never realized she didn't speak. She thought about the way she had smiled at him, the way she had pretended not to see him, how natural it had felt to erase him without ever raising her voice. That was the part that haunted her now, not the moment itself, but the ease. She remembered her own beginnings in this city, how often she had been overlooked when she was younger, how desperately she had clawed her way into a role that finally made her feel visible. And yet, somewhere along the way, visibility became power, and power became a blindfold. She closed her laptop and sat in silence, the room around her dim, her reflection staring back from the darkened screen. She didn't know if she would ever return to Hargrave, but she knew she would never return to that version of herself. Elsewhere, in a private office near the top of the tower, Madison Covington began drafting a proposal not out of obligation, but out of responsibility. It outlined structural reforms, real ones, not symbolic gestures, and included measurable practices for equitable access, accountability channels for client-facing roles, and the formation of a review board that operated independently of internal leadership. Her name would not be attached to the final release. She didn't want credit. She wanted repair, not for the firm's reputation, but for its soul. She knew the process would be slow, resisted, buried under bureaucratic friction and whispered cynicism. But she had seen the look in Malric's eyes. She had read every word of his letter, felt the precision of his disappointment, and knew that if even a sliver of truth remained in what they stood for, then they had to earn it back through action, not performance. Down on the street, the pace of the city continued without pause, unaware of the internal awakenings taking root within those glass walls. But change doesn't announce itself. It does not ask for permission. It begins with a fracture, with discomfort, with someone who refuses to disappear. And then slowly it spreads. In his apartment, Malric stood at the window, sipping coffee as the morning sun cut across the skyline like a new language. He had received no more calls from Hargrave. No new apologies. No demands. Only silence. And that silence felt honest. It felt like the first true acknowledgement of what had occurred. Not because they said the right words, but because they had finally stopped speaking long enough to hear what had always been there. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady. He felt whole. What they took from him had not broken him. It had revealed them. And now that revelation belonged to others, not just to him. To every professional who had entered spaces built to ignore them. To every person who had learned to lower their voice, smooth their edges, and pretend they weren't uncomfortable just to survive. His story had given them something more than vindication. It had given them a name, a precedent, a light. And that mattered. As the hours passed, he moved through his day without spectacle. He reviewed new investment proposals. He responded to quiet inquiries from people who had once looked through him and now looked to him. He didn't speak of the week behind him. He didn't need to. That week had already done its work. It had exposed the truth and planted the seed of change in the very place that once tried to erase it. The transformation ahead would not be fast or perfect, but it had begun. And once truth begins to move, it cannot be stopped. It becomes a current that pulls others forward. Malric watched the sun climb higher, a slow arc of promise against a city that still had so much to learn. But now, it would have to learn differently. It would have to learn the cost of blindness, the power of presence, and the quiet justice that grows in the space between endurance and revelation. The end. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I want to hear from you. What do you think about the plot so far? Was there a moment that stood out to you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And where are you watching from? Drop your city or country down below. I read every reply. Let's talk.